All right, well, hello and welcome everyone to another buildingSMART webinar. This is part of the virtual summit for spring 2022. Thank you for joining. My name is Jeffrey Ouellette and I'll be your moderator today, but also working with Greg on the presentation. This is technical room 2, so session 2, I should say. And we're looking at the future of IFC and openBIM. What is essentially setting up the mission for the technical room for the year. The webinar is scheduled to last, is it 2 hours? And we'll have, time for Q&A. We may not go the full 2 hours. That's fine. It is being recorded and will be made available in the replay section of the event in around 24 hours after we've stopped the webinar. Before I hand it over to Greg, I'd like to remind you that everyone is muted for the duration of the webinar. If you got any questions, if you look to the right, there's a comment section, and you can enter those in that chat box. I'd also like to bring your attention to that the fact that the buildingSMART is committed to ensuring participation in the development of standards is unrestricted. The process for their adoption is transparent, and the standards are developed to not favor any particular provider and are open, non-binding, accessible to all. Please take note of our antitrust code of conduct. There's a link there. It can also be found on the buildingSMART main website. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Greg. Greg, if you want to go ahead and start your share.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Morning, afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen here. So thanks for joining today. This is sort of an introduction section. I don't know what, there's a piece of a word I'm missing and I can't figure out how to say right now, so I'll just skip it. To the work, as Jeff said, that we're looking to do in the technical room in the course of the year and probably beyond that. And really, just to level set things, the technical room, for a lot of areas, really is its job is to review technical submissions that are trying to be sort of eventual buildingSMART standards or work that's being done by other rooms that have technical aspects. A lot of the ongoing work is not handled in the technical room. The technical room is the volunteer side of the organization. But we thought we do sit in a good place to sort of look at this next IFC question and take over from the work that others have started and really start to be a collector of, I will say, functional use cases, and we'll go through what that means. So that's where we're going to start today. So if we talk about the future of IFC, I think it's just important to set, like, why is there have to be a future and why can't we just continue the way it is? I think that everybody's realizing the use cases, not a word, and audience for IFC has never been greater, which is an absolutely good thing. But what's being asked of IFC is growing larger and encompassing all the time. Like, can we have X? Can we have Y? Capabilities, and that's something we should support, but at the same time we should do the work to make sure it's not making the standard impossibly hard to implement. And then a lot of the newer domains that coming online, the use cases have a mismatch with the technical capabilities of sort of historical, sort of one step physical file per authoring tool file. There are variations on that, but that's largely a way that the files are used today, and like a large horizontal assembly or a project that often doesn't make sense. It's actually an assembly of projects. So thinking about those things are important. And then obviously different customers have different needs. The design and construction world has a sort of often large amount of data that needs to change often, versioning, tracking, representations that are different between different owners, drawing generation potentially. These are important areas that certainly happen in the operations side of things, but they're different frequency and different data access requirements and amalgamation requirements. And at the same time, the number of software developers that you want to be able to easily build tools is growing all the time. So I think it's important that we sort of start to think about describing these things not to come up with a, oh, we should have a new representation beyond the XML, SDF, RDF or RDF representations, but more along the lines of describing what IFC needs to do and how it needs to behave. This is very much going to build off of, on the much more technical side of things, the work that was done over the last sort of wrapped up in 2020, which was this sort of documentation effort to just collect issues and topics around what next-gen IFC would look like. In this particular slide, what you see, there's a GitHub link. When the little slides are shared, you can go there, but if you notice, it's buildingSMART next-gen IFC. You can go there today, it's open. This is a more technical view, and this particular topic towards the technology-independent IFC actually has to do more along the lines, well, sort of both along the lines of data representation, but also how we document the standard, because in this work, if you go through, you see things like, well, this step representation has things in it that you can't represent in UML, and similar ideas to those sort of things. So it's important to understand, well, how do you make the definition of IFC portable, and hence the title, but then also that translates over to how it's represented as instance files as we move forward. So this is a good example of the kind of work that came out of that. This is a list of items that were generated. There's much more description. I just copied and pasted to put the presentation together. But these are the sort of 10 principles that were thought through as how to handle this on a technical side of things. Follow contemporary standards. Like if you were in the last presentation on the topic of IDS, there was a line item, use regular expressions. It's a very simple thing, but sometimes we have domains that like to invent things, but using something as simple as regular expressions as part of a standard versus using an invented standard. Simplicity over complexity, no single purpose resources. This is talking about in the standard itself, do we have like complexity because we don't, just because someone thought we needed one thing and that resource is sort of just dangling out there by itself. I think you can go through these, but like versatility, clarity, appropriateness, reduced implementation effort, both in the authoring and processing side of things are important from a sort of a data use. And then modularity, given what I mentioned about, and everybody's aware of what's happening in 4.3, the sort of ever increasing scope, that you should have a modular approach to the standard versus a monolithic one, which is certainly we have modularity, but whether or not it's been documented as such or implemented as such is an open question. Along with that, I would encourage you to look at the issues, which is basically used to capture some of them functional, some of them very technical. But this is one that was just added in the, this is from this morning, so 28 days ago. A very practical thing that has a solution in the sort of base standards we use, but we haven't implemented because we are where we are when it comes to the step implementation. But basically, how to join or reference shapes from within individual IFC files. So the idea here was, can I put a column from an architect and a column from a structure together, because that's the whole column? How do you do that in IFC? It's pointed out here. Well, this is actually sort of well thought through in STEP. And here's an example of how that could look like. But the coda to this is, well, because this is a newer version of STEP, the current version we're using doesn't implement this capability. So this would result in an invalid file. So both capturing functionality, and this is definitely the approach that we're going to spend most of the time on, experimenting on this side of the world, on the technical side, the implementation side, but to prove out functionality more than to prove out solutions, I think is the way we should look at the world. So why now? I think I've sort of started to describe this. I think that the last point there, or the first point and the last point are important, is that the number of organizations, customers, software vendors that do both use and customization is getting thinner all the time. So the number of people that build software that use that software is increasing. And so it's important that it's not only a supply and consume side thing that we support, but actually both. And then largely IFC needs to work well in a digitized world, not in the historic one building, one-time exchange world. And this is sort of just talking through this, trying to sort of set out the world in which IFC sort of lives in. This is, a diagram from Cesium, which is one of many sets of standards that tries to incorporate, sort of from a large to a small scale, but is really an assembly format, largely used around GLTF. It's not an authoring format, but it could be certainly part of some sort of digital twinning discussions or geospatial. At the same time, we have things as detailed as fully, sort of fleshed out mechanical models that represent individual elements within a building. So an elevator assembly. These are just to, point out which tools created these things. And then you have new domains, which I'm sure you could author a piece of or a part of a wind farm in IFC today, but this sort of convergence in infrastructure that's happening is an important aspect. And I would say on top of just the infrastructure, this sort of larger scope of analytical data information that actually is part of this larger, if you're to call it a digital twin discussion, but basically this, like all these data sets to come together to make a piece of infrastructure or built work or a building or what have you. And then new kinds of representation. This is just one, photogrammetry, point clouds, been around for a while, but we've had discussions, but sort of new things come up into the time as you get underground, like geospatial approaches. And historically, I think the view of within buildingSMART might have looked something like this, or not even within buildingSMART, like the default approach is probably a better way to say that, is that, well, you take all this stuff and sort of translate it into IFC, which is becomes an ever-growing container. But at the same time, well, if we know the current mechanisms we have in buildingSMART to be a container of this data is not great, and there's standard bodies working on all kinds of things, then we sort of probably need to think about sort of an approach that links to, passes, connects to, and integrates with sort of this sort of world. So what functional requirements are here? Who knows? There's thousands of them. So the goal is not to sort of describe detailed workflows, but understand that someone, customer, vendor, user of a piece of software might want to have a workflow that connects reality data to the bridge that sits on the terrain that integrates with sort of lifecycle management and a power grid. These are things we have to think about. What does that functionally mean to make integrations without making IFC trying to be one format to rule them all? So where to start? I am very much a function first, and we're trying to, as much as possible, we're going to take that approach, not to jump to an explanation of the technical solutions, because there's many different ways to come about a technical solution to this, like the, sort of multiple representations in one IFC file, or linking representations between IFC files is we could use the step version. Understood. It's a requirement of behavior, not necessarily a capability that's bound to the step representation. So very much thinking about function first. So to do this, we're thinking that the work has to be around collecting use cases, supporting and showcasing experimentation. There's actually quite a bit of work happening, and it's accelerating, both in, what does IFC in the web look like, which is something like we've shown in the past here, which is IFC.js, but also tools like Speckle and the work about IFC JSON has done previously is, well, are there encodings or capabilities that make living on the web but not losing capability things we need to integrate into the different serializations or representations that we support? And I think it's important to understand that, like, thus far we've had many representations, but certainly had a primary. Is there a future where we link functionality to primary and don't make them so specific to one format? These are all questions I think we'll have to answer, but it's not, we need to start with function. And then because I'm actually not a software developer, but I'm an architect and technologist, I found it really useful to mine discussions and interesting things from other technologies and industries that look like us. So later this week, actually tomorrow, we'll have 2 of those, in which we'll hope to have more during the course of the year as we sort of move this effort forward. Is we'll have Epic Games talk about one of the technologies. So sorry, I need to put this out of order. We'll have Epic Games. I'll come back to the Epic Games discussion, but we'll have two vendors talk about 2 very different technology approaches, but understanding how they sort of tackled the problem. So that will be Epic and Bentley talking about iModel.js, and Epic talking about one file per actor is the way it's discussed. So we also have the work we've started, and this is why we think Dennis and I are uniquely suited to sort of take on this work from a functional standpoint, because we've actually are very much doing the experimentation on the use case side of things. So Dennis and a larger group of people have been working on IFC JSON, which is a serialization to sort of obviously IFC SPF in JSON, or the Express version. That's parallel to the Express schema, but obviously the web use case is here. So, this is the distinction between, there are tools that show IFC in the web, but basically what they're doing is converting IFC into another format to make it function well on the web, which is largely something we, from a functional perspective, we think you shouldn't have to do, because then you have the opportunity for data loss. But IFC itself is not well suited there, so hence the work. And then if you were here on the last virtual summit, I gave a presentation about specifically very early in design, or not very early, but during design and construction, there's this distributed data problem, and multiple owners of the same entities, I think, is the best way to think about it, where really what you're doing is assembling data. You're not handling final author data from one entity to the next. So non-linear assembly of information. So I appreciate, if you're interested, you could go back to the site and look at the summit, because all the recordings are available if you go through the buildingSMART website to watch. But it sort of sets the stage on the work I've been doing, which is like trying to functionally describe the way our data needs to work. You'll see a lot of sort of graph-looking diagrams, but I am very careful to stay away from a particular technology implementation. So since then, the work I've been doing is actually focused on a very specific use case during a design phase to enable near real-time updates of IFC data. And if everybody sort of understands that the way that typically works today is one single, let's say it's a step physical file, one single physical file being represented on disk, that can take a lot of time. It can mean you're duplicating a lot of data on export. So if only 3% of the elements change, but you have to replace all the elements, that's a problem. That's problematic to keeping it updated, and also, sort of very simple things like versioning and change control. So I've sort of taken on to do an experiment, and these very much are experiments, but we'll probably be spending more resources on in the coming months, is to basically test out, well, what can you do if you have a file per actor, or a file per element is the best way to say this. So basically that means a curtain wall is one file, a door, a wall is one file. Certainly some weird things, but given IFC is flexible, you don't lose much. It's just at this point, the tools don't know really how to react to it. This data is open, just like the IFC JSON work. If you feel like experimenting with these files, it talks through how they're being arrived at and the logic behind it. But it's informing thinking about, okay, if I can think about these individual elements as being composable, as in they're raw bits of data, but to the first question that was asked in that next IFC forum, like, well, actually a slab is an assembly of two pieces of information from a structural model and architectural model. Is that sort of like an object assembly? And if I'm, sort of trying to have in the design space, trying to make a package of information, am I actually making something much more akin to a mechanical assembly? And those are versioned. Again, this is just a diagram about the thought process that I personally am doing to solve sort of on the design side of work, but I think these are the discussions that sort of we want to make part of the ongoing discussion on what IFC needs to support. And over here, you sort of quickly realize, well, if you do something like this, you have to think about externalizing certain capabilities that are natively in the files today, and how does that start to look? And then if you sort of drill in deeper, you start to think about, well, how wide or how deep is an assembly, and if we take linking together approaches versus making monolithic data sets, can you have multiple data sets come together to make an assembly, but it doesn't have to be a monolithic data representation? And again, in some tools, this actually works pretty well. It's a little confusing because most of them don't see small little files, but in the use cases of prototype thus far, you are not losing any data. You're actually just gaining flexibility, but a little file management. So I mentioned that tomorrow we'll have a session that includes two different examples. So on the Unreal side of things, we're having somebody speak, not very long, but on the sort of design dynamics of one file per actor, which is really the idea that to make version and change management in Unreal, which is a game engine, for the authoring side of things, they've implemented a new capability that does something very similar to what I'm representing in IFC. Instead of treating the project as a monolith, treat it as a set of files that you assemble, which certainly in the game world looks a lot different, but you sort of have to tackle the same things. And then a different take on this problem is what's been done. I think we've potentially talked about this before, is what's behind the iTwin effort from Bentley, or iModel.js, which is really the iModel, and underneath all of that is a SQLite representation. And there have been many examples in our industry of sort of academic or one-off implementations of SQLite. And clearly there was a use case expressed behind them, and there's a reason that iModel exists. So it's trying to understand by sort of comparison why different choices were made on sort of technologies from a functional standpoint. And I can go into those a little bit, but certainly it's good to have the feedback. So you actually, SQLite is like one of these things that you see everywhere when you start to look for it. It's the most used database format in the world. But, sort of I don't want to say it's a non-IFC tool, but I think the IFC is not the key aspect of this proving ground application. We won't hear from them this week, but their implementation of bringing together IFC into single SQLite files, but multiple representations in one, is an interesting problem. And then I don't think we've ever had them in our session, but we have had Blender BIM talk at the buildingSMART Summit. One of the things that I think is interesting is, that it's a Blender implementation, and there's sort of specific things that are trying to take advantage of capabilities in IFC that aren't necessarily used all the time. But I think the learning here is a more sort of nuanced one, where Dion Molt specifically points out that, well, IFC largely operates like a series of subgraphs. And so what you actually do from a software development perspective to make a editing tool of IFC is you actually have to figure out how to modify those subgraphs versus thinking about, is it a monolithic file? And so this is an interesting one that looks very different from the approach I'm testing out, because it doesn't try to disaggregate the data, but at the same time tries to allow updating versus export is the way to think about that. And this goes back to my work. What I'm working on is I'm very much thinking about, well, if you can get versions of IFC data external to the design authoring tools, you can do that in a way that's nearly with zero latency, or nearly any latency, as in within minutes of changes happening in the native tools, you have data outside, and you have the components that versioning workflows alongside external data become possible, because it's much simpler to link this here. There's certainly different ways to do this, but again, it's sort of both a mix of me working on internal HOK problems, but at the same time bringing this forward as, well, one way to solve this is to sort of do an object by object representation, and then potentially even have a single IFC file back to that, sort of GitHub item that could actually be the, if you will, the overall scene graph that links all these things together. All of these things should be explored, but at the same time, focusing on functionality. And again, here's another example of just speaking to capabilities that I'm exploring, and I'm bringing it up here to sort of give the context. When doing this by element IFC file, what you realize is, well, clearly you need to make merged IFC files at some point, that sort of something that looks more traditional. But the key insight I think is interesting is you don't have to make the same ones that we traditionally make. So an idea that you could have sort of a source data set that it's merged together in different components, but also that you could merge from other data sets. So instead of having a design representation, you have a fabrication representation, and you have a sort of pool of information that looks more like code than in a software development sense. And then you can then make sort of small things. So this is obviously, anybody that's paying attention of this sort of graphic will look, well, this would be perfect for Git. And that's why I'm sort of testing it, because if you use LFS and Git, you can do versions, revisions, and sort of have a nice demonstration of a capability that would, on the design side, would be nice to have. So we actually don't have that many slides, so we said this could go 2 hours. It's not going to go 2 hours unless there's a ton of questions or feedback from others. Really, the point of today's session was to introduce the topic, talk about why we think it's important to sort of begin this journey, use this week to start the conversation about the sort of roadmap for the technical room. We don't want to say we have it all figured out today. We're going to have a session TR4 on Thursday that will really start to talk about how should we go about doing this in a public way. What are the inputs from people? We'll be very focused on, again, capability and functional use. I think that's one of the things we sort of skip over. We often do very detailed functional use things like IDMs and then on to MVDs, but at the same time, we sort of miss this higher level functionality. And as we go into looking at what a next version of IFC needs to support, we think it's important to have that conversation first, and we're well suited for it. Dennis more than me on the more technical details, but again, that's the sort of thrust of the discussion we're starting this week. So I will stop sharing unless someone wants to have me reference the slide.
We don't have any questions yet. My major focus is really on the process enabling and facilitating all this. So while I do have some of my technical opinions, really my biggest concern is making sure everybody understands, you know, how we go about collecting all these things, where we can find things, where we do it, all of that, you know, so that we want to be as open and transparent as possible, because I think this is one of the biggest criticisms of lots of buildingSMART developments in the past. I wouldn't say in the recent past, but in the far past, was nobody knew what was going on. And it wasn't because there was an intention of being opaque. It's just a matter of, well, you know, you kind of just had to know, and then know who to talk to and know where to get in, and you know where to be in order to do that. And we want to make sure that we get as much input from as many different corners as possible to come up with the best solutions.
So it was in the slides, but it's worth noting that there was a call yesterday that somebody rightly so pointed out that one of the more technical things we were discussing, well, it used to happen by implementers agreements, but with the scale and breadth of buildingSMART, like there's a lot more than 10 implementations. So the idea that you could have an in-the-know group to make those decisions and it's not well documented, not public, is really challenging at this point.
So some comments are starting to stream in. Leif, a long time buildingSMART technical contributor.
My predecessor.
Your predecessor.
De facto, because I said I would do it years ago. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think this points exactly to the thoughts that emerged out of the work even being done for IFC 4.3, and more of the use cases that came up. It's, you know, how do we go beyond, as Greg said, you know, one step physical file per person, per use case, per process, whatever you want to call it, and say, well, what if we don't want to exchange files? You want to exchange information, right? It's about exchanging information. It's not about exchanging the product itself.
Well, and I would just say to Leif that we sort of that's an obvious conclusion that everybody's come to. We've never done a very good job of documenting like the compendium of versions of that story, right? There are great examples of them out there, but if we don't have a good reason to say, well, we actually need files and not files. Why do we need both, and how would they work?
Mm-hmm.
Because of X.
Yeah, and I think Andre's comment too is, you know, a lot of what Greg was pointing out is, you know, if you begin to, we've said for a long time that the value of IFC is the schema. It's not a particular format or particular file, you know, file type or whatever. It's that semantic definition of, when you look at the built environment, how do we come to a common understanding of what it should look like in terms of software, but also in human thought, right? And then how do you build off that? If you decouple that definition, that schematic that semantic representation from the technology, you know, then what's possible?
Yeah, and this is, I'm trying to push real hard to flip this back into a functional discussion.
Yep.
Like this one in particular, graphs are really useful because the use case is I want to sort of be able to do graph searches or make connections that don't exist in the data itself because of the way the graphs are structured. So that's a functional requirement that drives you toward a representation that is a graph. Like we should always make, there's a, I don't know if it's, I should say it this way, but sometimes there's an either or approach to that world. And if you look at how graph technologies are used today, often they're repositories, not the editing environment. So what's the functional difference that you'd want a graph as an editor versus a graph as a repository? Again, these are the nuance, I think, is important here when we have these discussions, because it's you can get the like the understanding that there's one version of IFC is going to solve all problems, or one representation, and I don't think that's the case.
Mm-hmm. So wow, it seems like there's something big that has to be changed. Well, and I think that's what we're coming about is that everything's on the table, right? And really the previous work that Leon had started with a smaller sort of task force was to say, okay, given what we know, what would we do differently?
Yeah, and I think I'm just trying to point out that we have, like, the complaints around IFC, let's say from the developer community, is its complexity. What we never get is complaints on the richness of the capability it provides. Well, maybe somebody doesn't want it and they throw it away, but the richness of the representation is the thing we should leverage and not be sort of beholden to the way we represented it in software previously, but not losing that connection to the sort of richness of the representation. So that's the balancing act we have to set up. But again, we're not going to start this by saying SQLite solves all problems, so we should have one of those, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, Edgar's point about tooling, I think also plays in this idea about being technology and agnostic, in that we also don't want to have to rely on a tooling on the back end to a particular vendor or anything. So, Enterprise Architect is actually one of these things that's being used right now, or was used in the process of developing IFC 4.3, especially from the infrastructure side. And of course, the problem with that is that, well, then it requires that you have a license for Enterprise Architect in order to interact with it. It's like, well, why? If we're dealing with UML, we should be able to use any UML tool in order to be able to interact with the schema and such. So yeah, so what's just as important is to say you want to be technology agnostic on the implementation or use end. We also want that to happen on the development and semantic schema end as well. And it's not necessarily, it's not easy, but that's the whole point of this mission and this exercise, is to explore those things and figure them out.
I can't highlight, that's an important one. I can't highlight Leif's second to last comment. But that's one of the problems too, Rich.
Oh, this one.
Yeah, so this particular one, it was certainly pointed out in the sort of next IFC stuff you'll find on GitHub, is we're not going to do ourselves any favors if we don't prune techniques of doing the same thing as we move forward, because it just vastly increases the complexity of an implementation. And at the same time, just from a documentation standpoint and a growth of the standard, you could end up with a sort of ever evolving versions of the same thing. Because of the complexity of IFC, you could get there 5 different ways. I'm not saying that's the case, but there's certainly examples of this exact problem that we have to handle as we move forward.
Yeah, and IFC 4.3 is going to point sort of in that direction, where you have base MVDs. It's an imperfect solution, but it works for that existing paradigm, right? So again, if all things are on the table, it's looking at it from a new effort, and you say, okay, well, you know, do I need to, you know, with all the different representations, with all the different means of relating things to get, you know, to each other, do I have to have all those explicit, you know, relationships expressed in a semantic schema? Do I need one or do I need three versus, I don't know how many rels we have now. I think it's over a dozen. So.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it here, but certainly there was a discussion recently, and this came up again. If you go back to, I think it's the last summit where we had the folks from Bureau Happel on the BOM side of things, which have largely invented, and this is why we have had them in the past, or like these different groups of largely invented a class structure that is very inheritance based versus being and IFC is very inheritance based too, but that you inherit from the class, not the relationship. You don't fight me on this because like I said, I'm not a computer scientist, but just functionally, a wall inherits from another kind of wall that comes along with traits, whereas IFC is a little bit more expanded in doing such a thing. I'm going to stop talking about this because I'm sure I'm making people upset by the way I'm describing it, but I think it's an important sort of just thing we need to look is how are these getting representations in software, not IFC itself, but other representations of similar problems. Just reading some of the comments here.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you're going to have to help me.
Which one?
Viano? How do you say?
Vino.
Vino. So this is a perfect example. I think that in here is this sort of different standards together. You know, if you look at other industries, a lot of times you end up with another standard that like, oh, I'll replace everything. And you see a lot of this in the geospatial space. But I think there's a role for IFC here that really is just a link system between different representations. Maybe some of them aren't even in IFC, but because we have this sort of rich ability to describe relationships from different representations, then we have the language that's much richer than the other domains, that there's an opportunity for a flavor of this that IFC really doesn't try to ingest any of these other standards, but actually just links them together in a way that can provide depth that you wouldn't get if you just linked them directly. And again, linked, I'm using very generically. It could be cached in the same place, that could be spread on the web. It's not my looking. I just think about it to think about how those relationships can be expressed together.
Yeah, and you know, we also have a larger context to deal with within buildingSMART itself too, because we have these other standards and technologies like the BSDD, which plays a, you know, more prominent role in all of this. And you know, we also during this whole process, the things that we want to leverage is we want to leverage the tools that are already there for us to use. So we'll leverage the forums. We'll talk about this on Thursday. We'll leverage, you know, the work that's already been done and aggregated on GitHub. We'll talk about how we, you know, use meetings and, you know, how we document all of these things. You know, look at things like the use case management tool. How do we collect, you know, requirements? How do we have the discussions? And then I think, as Greg pointed out too, is we have a number of presentations in the past that we've heard from other corners of the industry regarding other techniques or other technologies that are being used to share information. We're going to have 2 more tomorrow from other industries about information. So how do we continue those discussions, have presentations, and then build off those with, you know, ways of sort of dissecting them and then learning the lessons that we can out of them.
Yeah, to just take what Jeff's saying and take a step back, like what's going on in the chat here is, you know, great, like these examples of different things that are working well. I think this falls to me in the category of, well, right now we use a summit, and do we know you're doing something at a summit, and that's how you know, sort of we reach out to see if you want to present. We think we need to be doing this on a monthly basis with different things as we move forward throughout the year to like make the process not room dependent, but effort dependent. So we're working on this modernization. Let's bring people together in a regular beat to show these interesting use cases, capture the functional requirements of, oh, why did you do it this way? What was the use that you wanted to get out of like PLCS? What's exactly that you're trying to do? And maybe they're implied, but actually extracting those out is a sort of useful task. But that's generally, sort of what we're really wanting to do, not listening to me and Jeff and potentially Dennis ramble on all the time, but set this up for this larger context that we're looking to in the near future.
And I think part of this too is, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way, is we're trying to get past purely academic discussions. We're, as Greg pointed out before, is getting into those real world use cases and saying, okay, we look at how the complexity has increased over time as we have more stakeholders, as we have more opportunities to share information across so many more tools and platforms for so many other workflows. How can we look at those in a meaningful way and say, well, what's working and what's not working, and get past sort of, theoretical discussion.
But, and yeah, I think that like academic discussions are important because they prove things. Because like I mentioned, Leif was my predecessor. Like the drum beat project, I think is what it was called. That was my introduction to the linked data discussions in probably 2010 or 2011. Very thorough. That got us into sort of engaging with the sort of linked data working group that became sort of the RDF representation in IFC. But we haven't really taken advantage of mapping that to a functional value to say, well, actually, let's support using RDF for those certain things. We sort of skipped to the standard part versus sort of making sure it was well supported in the community around use case. And the use case is definitely there. It's just we did the representation first.
Yeah, we don't plan on ditching academia, Andre. I think the important part is that we have to do a better job of harnessing, extracting the work of academia, and then also, and as Greg said, then proving it out in industry implementations and validating it, and then moving that forward. So hopefully we can maybe foster a bit more close relationships and working in those directions. I think that's one that's been very difficult, not just within buildingSMART, but in lots of different forums. I think our industry is uniquely bad at it. It's uniquely bad at connecting the work that is done in academia and how it relates and then is introduced back into industry and vice versa. I think, academia does a good job of pointing out things that are not going right in industry, and then figures out a solution or does the analysis and everything. But then industry does a terrible job of picking that up and doing something with it versus, say, biomedical or industrial or some of these other fields in which there's a tighter connection, but there's even also better industry involvement in the research and academic side of things.
And I think there's, this is definitely speaking from my role at HOK, strong need to sort of really figure out how to embrace sort of more than just publishing to open formats and working in open formats, like, and to continue this thought, like Michael, Joel, to your question about could you summarize in a few words, I think this is the, like, how do you say it? Not the wrong approach to like give you a direct answer, but saying all of the above. Like, Should key value pair plus object storage work for IFC? Should that you can implement in, sort of buckets anywhere in the world? Sure. Should it work for a SQL or a NoSQL database? Should it work for in-memory GPU use cases, drawing into the web or web GPU? All of the above. I think these are, we can't obviously focus on all of them, but my and our goal, Jeff's, Dennis's, and others, is to say that we need to really think about sort of a lot of stuff while we have this conversation. There's like, well, what is the hardware and web world doing? Like, because like my example of using per file stuff was novel, and then it became unnovel because disks were so slow, but now disks are fast, so not a big deal. So that's where the hardware world, what is a edge use case for an IFC representation differ from a centralized one? Don't know, but you could look at the sort of way those things are transmitted and moved around and re-represented, or linked to other data sets that IFC has very little to do with. So I think that last point by Edgar there is, sort of fundamentally important. But and this goes back to the work we're building off of. The standards have to be mutable into any format much more simply than they are today, because if we keep them in a, sort of locked into Express, let's say, and, the one everybody brings up is selects. Selects don't translate into UML very well, or to, sort of TypeScript or JSON schema. So the second you want to make a new representation of IFC, selects are a problem. This is sort of that first point of making it independent. So
yeah, and I think to Michael's point, I think we don't know yet, because at the same time we have to accommodate lots of different workflows, right? So that's sort of what the idea of, you have IFC step physical files, but you also have IFC JSON, and what you're trying to accommodate your different workflows, because not every situation, again, there's not a one size fits all, right? And if you decouple the information from the means in which the information is transmitted or shared, then we can begin to look at, well, what are all the different possible ways of doing it, so that you could say, hey, maybe there's an opportunity where somebody wants a monolithic IFC file. Great. And you can transfer a monolithic IFC file. But you have another use case where somebody says, no, I'm doing this real-time interaction with the data as I'm creating the model, and I want to do these analyses on the side. So I'm going to use a element by element distributed, streaming version of it. And, so we feel like we can accommodate both, but that doesn't, so we shouldn't have to lock down the strategy or the schema to only cater to one.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I'd point you to is, and I'll be clear, iModel, what we'll see on Wednesday, so Casey from Bentley will present about iModel. I wanted to have them speak because it actually tries to solve the file and web problem with one representation, not of IFC natively, but to me that's a perfect example of, cached big fat files are important to people that want to work live on fat desktop tools, but copies of that data getting moved around are really important as well. So to me, that's why specifically we wanted to have them speak, because it points to a one example of not having to make a false choice if it's possible. So I'm not saying that's the solution. It's not saying what IFC should look like. I just want to make sure we're sort of highlighting the what was the problem looking to solve, and why did they go to this representation to solve two problems at once.
Lots of good general comments and basically chatting between the members. Yeah, so I think like in Ken's case, I think again, this is, digging up a use case, presenting a use case, and then saying, okay, well, what do we do about this? What is the representation inside IFC? What is the representation in the other schemas being used for the tools and the processes in the particular use case? And then at what point do you say, well, is it all in IFC, or is it some type of connection, reference, link that puts that information in the right place, the right time, the right format for somebody?
Well, in this one particular, like IFC now, we've done the work to add the ability to add, I'm going to blank, it starts with an E, the code.
EPGS code.
Yeah, those codes. So we've done that work. But if you look at the geospatial world, out of probably necessity, they didn't start by putting it in the data set. They like geotiffs. Well, here's the TIFF. Here's this file that tells you where it is. It's an interesting parallel because from a functional standpoint, it means somebody can provide the data and somebody can provide the location. It's not one entity has to provide both. So I would like the idea that we should be able to geolocate files is important, but to me, functionally, it speaks to, well, does the expertise of locating all this data always rely on the people that are going to author one bit of the data? Or is it a sort of an amalgam, and that speaks to sort of this larger discussion?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure we could go on for a long time.
But thanks, everybody. I really appreciate the comments, the interaction online. We do save all of the chats for later for our purposes. We can dig out some of the nuggets in here and contact people if we've got further questions. Again, you can reach out to those of us at the technical room by just at technical at buildingsmart.org. It's the main mailbox that I use for the technical room, amongst other things. We'll talk about more in TR4 about how we're going to move things forward, what we'll do, so you'll have a better idea.
And I would even say, like, if you're really interested in this, I would say come to TR4 to suggest a topic you want to present or talk to your experience, because that's very much, technical room. We have a leadership committee. We'll continue to do that from a sort of what's the technical room's project? What are the things you want to see? What are you willing to present? What things you want to socialize? What's the regular beat in which we want to have these things? And that, like Jeff said, is on Thursday in TR4. And then tomorrow we're just going to have two speakers. It will not be long, but again, to contextualize just two examples of in industry and related industries, how they're solving similar problems.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And
Thanks
we look forward to seeing you at the next sessions. Have a good day.